Welcome to RealFixesRealFast.com. Today we're working on an 03 Mercury Sable. The car came in with a complaint that it was leaking power steering fluid. We checked it out and it's blown the seal out of the rack and pinion steering. So we're going to change the rack and pinion steering. Now, this being a Mercury Sable, will be the same procedure for most Tauruses. So we're going to show you how to do it specifically for this Mercury Sable. But many things that we're going to show you will be actually a common procedure for any rack and pinion steering that you're going to do. Of course, there may be some unique differences, so always refer to your service manual.
Anytime you're getting ready to take a steering column loose, you'll want to find something to strap it to. In this case, I've got it wrapped down around the seat post. You're going to end up leaving a little bit of play in it. That way that you can move the steering wheel if you need to from below to unhook the bolt, but it won't let it keep turning. If it kept turning, it would be able to snap the tape that's down in here to go up to the controls for the horn pad. One of the next things you do is you go out under the hood. We're getting ready to go below, loosen a little bit of the front cradle bolts and take the rear cradle bolts out so this engine can drop down and give us the clearance, as you'll see later, underneath. So by taking this out, it'll go ahead and let the motor relax down as we take the rear cradle bolts out.
We've got ours raised up on the lift. You take the wheel off, and then the next thing is the outer tie rod in. You have to do the same thing on both ends. Now you're going to have to use some type of a jack stand to support that cradle when you let it down. Now you can see the steering rack is up there, and the cradle actually has to be lowered so that you can get it down. So you just have to take the bolts out of the cradle. Now the steering rack itself bolts down through the cradle. It's held on with two nuts. You just need to loosen them.
As we're doing the cradle bolts that holds the rack in the main position there, this one on the passenger side is just above the exhaust catalytic converter, and there's very little clearance here, so it'll need to be taken off before you start dropping the cradle.
Now once you get those two nuts loose, the steering rack will actually come loose of the cradle, and that's the time when you can actually lift it up and you can rotate it. That now then will give you better access to get to the hydraulic lines that have to come off of it. Now you look from in here, we've got to get the steering boot loose because there's a coupling in there. Now take a pry bar and pry that boot up, and then you can see the little bolt that has got to come out. Once you get that boot up out of the way, you can usually use a long extension and then get in there to get that bolt out. Now you can see we've got the bolt out of that coupler. So you can just use a pry bar and get underneath that and pry that up. Now remember, we've got the steering wheel strapped so it won't turn. So when you pull this out, if it rotates a little bit, that's okay because we can actually rotate it back and forth to get it back in place. It will only go on there one way. We'll show you that when we take it down. Now inside here you have to be able to take the lines off. Use a line wrench if you have it, or just an open wrench. But these are the power steering lines that are going into the steering gear. This is also one of the reasons why you lower the cradle. It gives you more room to get your hands in there to get these lines loose. Now as you can see, this is tight quarters. You have to use the open side of the wrench, and you just have to go back and forth. So you're going to be here a little while trying to get these loose. It's about a quarter of a turn at a time. The one caution is don't try and force it, because when you want to re-thread these back in, if the threads are messed up, you'll have a terrible time. You take one off, and then we just got the other one to do. Sometimes in tight quarters like this, it's easier just to use what they call a stubby wrench. You can see the wrench is quite a bit shorter, that's why they call it the stubby. But you don't need as much room to throw the wrench. Now once you get the steering rack loose and you got the hydraulic lines off, you can rotate it and pull it out the driver's side. Now here's the shaft on the top of the rack, and you can see that there's a rounded bottom and two flats on the side, and this is what goes on that steering coupler, so it can only go on one way. So when you go to put the steering coupler back in, just rotate it around until your curve on the bottom and the two flats on each side line up.
Now that we've got it over to the bench, we're going to show you some of the things that we can show you from here. This bolt is the bolt that we took out of the steering knuckle from the steering shaft going down from the steering column. And the knuckle would go on here, and this would go through the eyelet and go into that groove. And once you bolt that down tight, that's what clocks that and locks it in place. One of the other things you want to do when you get the old rack on the bench, because you took it out with the steering wheel centered and straight, you want to measure from the center of this tie rod end, the center of the bolt would be the pivot. You don't want it sticking out like that or like that. You want it centered. Measure from the center of it up here to a good reference, such as the head of this. This would be 32 inches, and that would be the side that's from the passenger side. So you'd want to write down passenger side 32 inches. You're going to want to do the same thing from the other side. You're going to want to get center of the tie rod end, go up to a reference point such as this, and that would be 20 and 3/4 inches on that one. And that'd be the driver's side. Because if your new steering rack does not come with tie rod ends on it, or whether it does, you're still going to need them as a rough reference for your alignment so that your toe end is not really out of whack when you put the new rack in it. Because these can be a couple of threads off, or it can come without, which it often does, come without a tie rod end on it. You're going to have to put the tie rod end on it, and you're going to need to know what those base reference marks are, so when you start with your alignment as you put it back together, you'll be at least close. One of the other things you'll want to do is you'll want to look at this reference mark where this bolt goes through for the pinch bolt for the steering column. In this reference, if straight up was 12 o'clock, that would be at 1 o'clock. 12 o'clock straight up, 1 o'clock. So you're going to want to write down 1 o'clock on your notepad. When you do that, you'll take you a pair of vice grips. And you'll lock them onto this at 12 o'clock. When you get that, you're going to get a little bit of a fluid spray, so you're probably going to want to put this up over a container and catch this. But what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to find out how many turns to lock this steering rack came out at so that you can put the new one in at the same spot. This shaft goes down to a gear. This gear turns a geared shaft that's in here, and that sets up center from right to left on your tie rod ends. So what you're going to do is you're going to put your vice grips on here at 12 o'clock. Know that your groove for your bolt was in here at 1 o'clock. So you know where that reference was at. You put your vice grips on here at 12 o'clock from you so that you'll know that as a reference point. Now that you got your vice grips on there at 12 o'clock, you're going to turn this thing counterclockwise until it hits the end of its travel. So you count your clocks. You got half a turn, 1 turn, and as you see, we're spilling fluid over here, 1.5, and back around to about 5 o'clock. So I'm going to write that down. If you didn't do that clocking and aligning that up, when you get ready to put the steering rack in, first of all, one of the things you could run into is when you try to slide this shaft up into the knuckle that's from the steering wheel, it could be clocked wrong. And you might not get the part that this bolt goes in the right spot for the slot. Then after you get it put in, lock it down. Then when you start to set your steering wheel center, your toe ends, they could all be off. Your steering wheel could be off clocked one way or another, and your tie rod ends could be off. But by doing all this clocking work we was talking about with the shaft and the tie rod ends, when you put it back up in there, it'll go back up in place, and it'll start from a very easy place to do your alignment from. Depending on who you get your rack from, it may or may not have this little check valve restrictor plate in here. Down in this hole is a part that you will want to verify if your rack requires it, that it is in there, because it is necessary. Sometimes when you take the rack out and you're not aware this part's in there, you can be flipping the rack over on the floor, and this part can fall out and roll off somewhere. you not know it, you get ready to put the rack back in, and if it is a rack that requires this and that part's rolled off on the floor somewhere, you put the rack in, the rack is not going to work right. So you want to make sure if it's a rack that requires this, that part that is down in that hole. If it would by chance happen to fall out of your unit with this restrictor check valve, it literally can be set in either hole, but it is not correct in either hole. If you look down in this hole, down deep inside in here is a machined area. This is not built to accept this. This side is. So this will have to go down in that machined area. So you make sure you got it turned the right direction, because it could be set in there wrong, in the wrong hole. It could be set in the wrong hole upside down. But you want to make sure you're putting it in correctly in the right hole. Sometimes mechanics open up a new parts box and they pitch your paperwork aside. In this case, it would have been a good example to have not pitched that paperwork aside, but actually look through it a little bit. A lot of times, the check valve that we were referencing can or may not have a valve retainer in there. I found it more often than not does not have the retainer in it. You flip that steering gear over and that part can be rolling off across the floor and you not know it. So in this case, they're showing that it has 3 holes available. In our case, the gear that we pulled out, this first hole is a non-threaded hole, so you don't have to worry about it. It's not threaded, it's just an open hole. So you have 2, and the one that is closer to the shaft of the 2 you're using is the one that goes in, and it goes in with the shoulder up. So if you'll match this up to the shaft steering gear, you'll see that this paperwork with the 3 holes and the shaft sticking out matches the 3 holes with the shaft sticking out. It just so happens that this hole on this unit is not a threaded hole, so you don't have to make use of it. But these will be the 2 that you'll actually use that references these 2. So of those 2, the one closer to the shaft is the one that has the valve in it. We're going to take the plugs out of the new gear, and we're going to see if it came with a valve already in it, because if you didn't know that was in there, you flipped your old one out and went rolling across the floor, you get the new one and compare it to the old one, neither one's going to have a valve in it, and it could be put in without that in there, and then it's not going to work. So we've got the plugs out of it, and if you'll look down in this hole, you'll see that the new unit did not come with the valve in it, and that could have got somebody in trouble. You'd want to put this in with the shoulder thick end out, and it goes in the hole closest to the shaft. Just like that. And as you're putting it in, you want to make sure that it does not come out on you, and a good way to do that is temporarily put the plug back in it while you're wrestling the unit around to get ready to put it back in the vehicle. Okay, previously we showed you when we took the old old gear out, how that we clocked some things on it to make reference off of. So one of the first things we want to do is stand this unit up, put our vice grips on here, and you don't need to have it tight and hurt the shaft, just enough to turn it with. And we want to start off with it totally buried against the left-hand counterclockwise direction. Once we get that determined, you remember from our previous reference, we were going to put the vice grips on there at 5 o'clock. So with it buried to the left, our vice grips on it at 5 o'clock, we were turning the half plus the 5 o'clock. So there's the 5 o'clock. We'll start at the half turn. There is 1 1/2, and we're back to our 12 o'clock. So that way we set up this shaft to this rack as our reference point to start with. And then what we will do is we will take the old tie rod ends off, put them on here, and we'll make the measurements that we referenced earlier with the tape measure from a reference point to the center point, reference point to the center point. So we'll have to put these tie rod ends on the new rack. Some people will count the threads roughly to get a starting place for this. And you can do that to get a rough idea, and then when you get done, you can use the measurements that you had before. Depending on the rack you take out, if you've got some tie rod ends that's worn or been on there for a long time, this would be a good time to put new tie rod ends on with the new rack. But in this case, we're using the tie rod ends that we took off the old gear rack. Now we're going to set up the tie rod ends to match. We previously wrote down that the passenger side was 32 from our reference to center. And so now we're going to set this up to match that. When you've taken the old rack out, getting ready to install the new rack, there'll be some new Teflon seals that should come with the new rack. When you try to take these off, oftentimes they are a little stubborn. And so if you can get a pick under it and pick it and pry it loose and pop it off of there, then that's something that you can try to do. If it turns out that it's so tight on there that you cannot get a pick under it, you'll take a pair of pliers and get out here on it like this, and you'll squeeze it and draw it out. Squeeze it and draw it out, squeeze it and draw it out, and oftentimes if you hold that with your fingers, you'll have made a little pocket there. Then you can get that pocket and get a pick under that and remove that. When you get ready to put the new seals on, oftentimes they'll be so small they won't even want to screw on there. If you try to get aggressive with this, there's many ways that you can tear this little Teflon seal up, and then you'll be going getting some more. You don't want to do that. So if you try to force them on there to break them, if you try to heat them excessively, you can distort them. For me, the best thing I've found is to set it up on there and get a rough idea of how far off it is. In this case, it's not very much that it's going to take to go on there. But if you'll take that and put it on a punch, reference how far down that punch that'll go, and you'll want to just work that real gently down about another 1/4 of an inch. And do it slow because you're stretching that Teflon. If you do it fast, you can pop it. And you don't want to get carried away and slide way down here, because sometimes they can go this far before they'll pop if you do it in the right temperature. But if you'll just work that down about a 1/4 of an inch, a little bit at a time, it'll give that Teflon an opportunity to stretch without popping. You slide it off, and you try it again to see how close your sizing is. In this case, we've got it not quite, but we can go ahead and work it without forcing it. And that's what you want, because if you get it loose enough that it falls on there, once it gets to the bottom, it'll fall on out of your groove down here, and you don't want that either. But you'll just want to work it a little bit at a time. Sometimes you can screw them down in there, and sometimes you just kind of got to walk it down there. But as you can see, once you get to the bottom, you did not want to overdo the stretching, because once you get it down there, it's going to need to fit tight to that groove. And if you overstretched it, it would be wallery down there and would not seal well. Now that you get it down there, you'll want to work that in circles with your finger and push in a little bit and make it unstretch a little bit. Just like that. That'll be ready to go. once you get it set up in there close to in place, you'll want to put your lines back on it in the reverse order of what you took them off. I'm now taking the cap loose to the one that's got the restrictor check valve in it, because I have the rack up in there. It's not going anywhere now, so now I can take the cap off. We got the high side pressure line, the low side pressure lines with the Teflon seals installed into the rack and snugged up. We've got the line that has the bracket on it installed. It's in place. We're going to set the rack down in its subframe holes. Now that we've got the rack in its subframe holes, we don't really want to tighten them up yet. We want to go ahead and leave it loose so that we can move and maneuver the steering rack to go up into the steering knuckle. So we'll start raising the subframe up to the point that we can get access to work the steering collar back in place. As you can see with the video camera now, I'll point to it here. The steering shaft that comes down from above with the knuckle has got the area where the bolt goes in right there, and it's lined up with the groove that was in the top of the shaft that stuck up out there that we clocked when we was on the bench. So if this shaft going up the top is lined up with the groove to the front, the knuckle at the top is with the bolt to the front, that means that bolt and that knuckle will line up with each other. And to get those to line up, it's not as easy as it looks. Sometimes you kind of got to wiggle things around there a little bit, but we did happen to get this one to cooperate. So now what we're going to do is we're going to start raising the subframe up until we get it in place for our subframe bolts. And in the process of that, we want to watch the steering boot that covers that knuckle up there and work it down around that steering gearbox lip that's sticking out there. So now that we've raised the cradle up, got the rear cradle bolts about where they're ready to go, and we've positioned the steering boot down onto the steering rack until it touched that stop right there. So now it's against the stop. It should seal off good and stop any wind noises or any moisture or anything from getting up through there. So we're going to go ahead and put the cradle up, attach the tie rod ends, put the wheels back on it. And on rear subframe bolts, one of the things I like to do so that I do it fairly fast and not stress out too much about the torque on it, I usually like to use a torque stick on there. And that way you can hit it with the impact, get a good amount of torque on it, and it's really pretty close to right every time. We're going to put the tie rod end castle nuts on it. Start them with your finger. You can use an impact if you turn it down really low. Get them a little bit snug. Then you look for the opening for the cotter pin to go through. After you get the castle nut on there with some snug on it, then you bring it around to the first available hole so that the cotter pin can go in. What I've been told on a cotter pin, put the long tab down, put the cotter pin in place, hold it over with your thumb so it stays in place, get one of the tabs, bring it around, leave just a little bit of a extension of it sticking out, snip it off, and bend one tab so that you've got a locking tab and you've got a security tab.
Well, we're all done with the install. Now the next thing is it's going to need an alignment. As you can remember seeing, we disturbed the tie rod ends. We had to make those adjustments, the steering wheel center and so forth. So you definitely need to have an alignment done to make sure those things are correct.